So because we have a lot to get through, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to begin with a land acknowledgement. So Rocky Mountain Wild and Audubon Rockies both occupy the ancestral and traditional lands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and Oshete-Shekowin peoples. In offering this land acknowledgement, I ask us to recognize the state-sanctioned acts of genocide, displacement, and dispossession against the original and rightful inhabitants of this area and the challenges Indigenous communities face today as a result of past and current colonization. I also want to respectfully acknowledge the generations of stolen and enslaved Black people and their descendants who built and continue to build this country that we now occupy, as well as the violent history of US colonization and imperialism that has displaced generations of people from their ancestral lands abroad. I also want to recognize the long-standing systemic racism, including economic and environmental injustice, which has created conditions that continue to disproportionately impact marginalized communities across Colorado and beyond. As a first step towards accountability and reconciliation, I ask that we commit to knowing this history and honoring our collective ancestors who stewarded the land and protected the species native to it long before we came. I ask that we collectively learn to respect, trust, and affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, knowledge, and experiences, and pledge to support the land back movement and reparations in any way that we can until such time that the land is ceded to its rightful stewards and all marginalized communities are treated equitably with justice at the forefront. And just like with greater sage-grouse, they won't be helped by simply acknowledging that habitat loss is a threat. We need to take action. I ask everyone to take action and offer any meaningful actions that you are aware of in the chat. And I specifically would like to invite everyone to take an action today to support the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes' proposal to rename Mount Evans to Mount Blue Sky. And I'll be dropping the link into the chat. So thank you for taking a moment to think about all those things and hold those things in your space this afternoon. We're going to be talking with Daly today about greater sage-grouse. But before we start, some introductions. So I'm going to start. My name is Chris Talbot Heindel. My pronouns are they, them. I'm the communications and membership manager at Rocky Mountain Wild. And visual description for people who may have low or no vision or maybe on the phone today. I'm a light-skinned mixed race individual with shoulder length salt and pepper hair. I'm wearing some black headphones and a Gunnison Sage-Grouse Hero t-shirt. And I've got a shoji screen in the background. So I will pass it to Daly.
Hi. Well, it's really nice we have a small group today so we can really kind of have some more one-on-one conversations. My name is Daly Edmunds. I am the Director of Policy for Audubon Rockies and your speaker today. I go by she, her, and I am coming from you today from Colorado Springs on a weekend trip with my family. So you are seeing me in my hotel room. I'm short, brown-haired, mixed ethnicities, and really happy to be here today. Chris, how do you usually do this? Do you usually pass it along? Do we introduce everybody, or how do you normally do this?
We usually don't, but since we have a small group, we totally can if you'd like.
Okay. Well, if I will welcome folks, if you would like to turn on your camera, you're more than welcome to. If you want to turn off your audio and ask a question at any point, feel free to, or use chat box. Should I go ahead and get started then, Chris?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
All righty. Okay, so let me get to my screen. I'm going to start sharing my presentation with you all. So it is really exciting to be able to be here today. I've been working on greater sage-grouse since I joined Audubon in 2009, and it is quite a story. And so while this is Colorado Endangered Species Week, the greater sage-grouse are not federally protected in any means at this point. It is an amazing story about their conservation efforts. They are a species of conservation concern. So thank you so much for being part of it with me today. And Audubon Rockies is a regional office of National Audubon Society. And I'm kind of curious if you can go to your, just because that is a nice small crowd, go to your reactions bar. I think you should be able to see that. Do folks have that, Chris? To be able to give a thumbs up, etc.?
Yes.
Yay, thanks, Chelsea. Awesome. Okay, well, I'm curious, have folks heard of Audubon before? Yay, okay. Awesome. Oh, okay, Chelsea, well, welcome. So Audubon is, National Audubon Society has been around for about 100 years, and our focus is on conserving birds and the habitat that they need. And I'm part of the regional office that covers Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah. And actually our regional office headquarters is in Fort Collins, which is where I'm normally based out of. And in these 3 states, we have 95,000 members and 21 independent chapters. So you, depending on where you're sitting right now, there's likely you're sitting within a territory covered by one of our 10 chapters in Colorado. So I'd encourage you to find out who your local chapters. They offer wonderful birding trips and all other kinds of activities. Our staff work on 6 different programs. The one that we're going to be talking about today is the Sagebrush Ecosystem Initiative. There's tons of resources on our website if you want to have, there's tons of free educational resources. We have lesson plans. We also have, it's springtime. And so this is a great time if you're thinking about planting your garden. We have a whole native plant section full of great resources. I've redone my entire front yard. It's been awesome. So all kinds of great resources. Take a look at our website. And if you have any questions, I'm also going to throw my email at the end of the presentation tonight. And let's see. I'm trying to see if I can't forward. Hold on, let's see. And I did warn, Chris that unfortunately where I'm sitting at a hotel has really poor reception. So I am hoping that this is even going to work, because there we go. Okay, so we're going to be kind of focusing today on greater sage-grouse. I'd love to be able to share with you some things about their life history, their populations, where do you find them, and about their home, the sagebrush ecosystem. And then the complexities of managing them. What are the threats they're facing? And then finally, this has been a long drawn out saga. Where do they stand today? And I am super, super excited to see Allison on the call as well. And she has a wealth of information on this topic as well. So welcome folks to jump in if they have additional information. So biology of greater sage-grouse, they are North America's largest native grouse species. They are they are a priority for our Sagebrush Ecosystem Initiative because they are so connected to the sagebrush ecosystem, which is a vast, incredibly biologically important ecosystem. In fact, they're considered a sagebrush obligate species, meaning their survival depends on the health of this ecosystem, and they are an incredibly effective barometer of its health. They are incredibly camouflaged. You have a female at the top of your screen and a male at the bottom of your screen. And so you can see a photo of the female, how well she blends in there. And so the best time to really see them is when they're on their leks, which is their breeding grounds in the spring, which is usually between March and May. But they are an incredibly neat species. And when you think about the size, they are often referred to as sort of a football-sized bird, weighing about 3 to 4 pounds. So these are some images of the grouse when they're on their leks. Curious, have folks ever had a chance to go to a sage grouse lek and see a bird up close, or maybe not up close, but in person? If so, give me a thumbs up or a checkbox or whatever works. All right, so, Matt and Chelsea, there are some great ones in Northwest Colorado. And maybe Allison can help, and Rocky Mountain Wild can help point in right directions. But there are, these breeding grounds. Again, because remember how camouflaged I said they were? The time to see them best is when they're on their leks here. And these leks are really kind of bare ground surrounded by sagebrush. And they go to these leks year after year after year. They have strong connections to these leks. And so males will arrive first. And they will actually fight each other to attract the attention of females. They'll strut around. You can kind of see them there with their tails fanned out, and they'll emit this drumming sound that comes from these orange air sacs on their chest in that bottom right-hand corner. And these air sacs are amazing. They'll actually squeeze nearly a gallon of air in here, and sound will travel for up to 2 miles. It's really an amazing moment of natural history to observe. So let's think about, like, where are sage grouse? So sage-grouse are found across 11 states and 2 Canadian provinces. They are found in the dark green is where they're out found today. In the light green is their historical range. And I put this image here because this map because I also wanted to show where the Gunnison sage-grouse. They are a distinct species that are determined as being threatened by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and protected under the Endangered Species Act. That is since 2014. So we're not going to be talking about that. We're talking about greater sage-grouse, which are up in the northwest corner of the state. And they are found in about 56% of their historical range. There is an amazing connection of sage-grouse to the peoples of the West. They really fed the westward migration, and today they are still a very strong part of many of the native communities, tribal nations through there. That photo was actually, the bottom right was taken in central Wyoming, which was a celebration of the passing and the contributions of a research sage-grouse biologist. And you can see the chicken dance, which is being performed there, has very strong connections to the sage-grouse. So where are they found? Okay, so most of the birds are found in Wyoming. Again, remember we talked about how sage-grouse are very tied to sagebrush habitat. These habitats, they are completely tied to them as they're roosting, their cover, their food. And if they really need large tracts of uninterrupted sagebrush habitat. So that's why you have the majority of the birds found in Wyoming, and then you have Montana's next after that. Colorado has about 4% of the birds, about 11,000 of them. What's interesting about Colorado is even though we're on the periphery of the birds' range, we are incredibly politically important. Okay, so now we learned a little bit about sage-grouse. We learned that they are in these high desert elevations. We learned that they need sagebrush. In fact, what's interesting in this photo, it reminds me, sage-grouse, 99% of their diet is on sagebrush. They have sagebrush leaves and buds. They are the only species that I know of that actually gains weight in the wintertime. They are an incredibly hardy species. Now, the bird is managed by state game and fish agencies. In Colorado's case, that's Colorado Parks and Wildlife. The habitat is managed primarily by federal agencies, because if you look at that that pie chart, 64% of them are found on federal lands. Again, we're talking Bureau of Land Management lands. And this cool picture, I want to show you just how hard it is to see a sage-grouse. Down the very bottom of the base of that sagebrush plant is a hen on some chicks. Isn't that amazing how camouflaged she is? So they are really tied to this ecosystem. Now, what is it about this ecosystem? The sagebrush ecosystem, remember I said is North America's largest ecosystem. It is found, so the bird is found in 11 states. The sagebrush ecosystem actually extends to 13 states. And there are, associated with this ecosystem, there are 350 plus species of conservation concern. There's, depending on what area you're talking about, you can actually have anywhere between 400 to 600 different species. But just in this ecosystem, there's 350 species of conservation concern, meaning that we're worried about how they're doing. This is a high desert elevation. These sagebrush plants, there's 18 of these different kind of sagebrush plants, different species. They have deep roots. And if you look at that graphic, see how much deeper it goes in all the others. They're really long-lived, and those deep roots allow them to be really, to take advantage of this arid ecosystem. They go down really far to access limited water. And they really are an anchor to this ecosystem because these plants sit up above the ground and they capture all that snow. And so the area around it is nice and moist, and it also buffers the wind. So they serve as important nurse plants to other native plants around the area. So they are an anchor to it. And in that graphic at the bottom there is a ton of wildlife that are unique to the sagebrush ecosystem. And it is a biologically rich species. They are considered an indicator species, and that's why even though the Audubon program, what we work on is a sagebrush ecosystem initiative, it's not the sage-grouse, it's sagebrush. We use sage-grouse as sort of a keystone or indicator species, as do many management agencies. So do we know much about this bird? We actually know a ton about this bird. For being a bird that is, or species of conservation concern, again, a species for which we are worried about how they're doing, there is an enormous amount of science. And I can tell you, I actually have a wildlife background, and most of my field work has been on big game and predators. So I've had a chance to go out and do greater sage-grouse trapping. It's hard and it's incredibly cold. These birds are so hardy. The image that you see on the top left of your screen is an ATV. Someone is driving that ATV and they flash, or they put their lights out, and they're looking for eye shine. Once they spot eye shine, they will then there's someone sitting behind them, hop off, and you'll see him walking. And what I wish the photo showed is he's actually carrying a huge fishing net. It's like this 6-foot pole with a big net at the top. And they run up on the bird and they put the net over the bird, and they're able to handle him and capture him that way. They end up putting a band on the leg. They take samples, they may measure to see how the bird's body condition is doing. And then they end up usually putting some sort of a marker on the bird, some sort of a transmitter. And what you have here is they have a collar that goes on her, and it allows us in the scientific and management community to be able to learn about how this bird is doing. So we have an enormous amount of information and understand what the species requires to survive. So from all of this science, I present you an incredibly ugly map. And it is ugly for this very clear reason, is that managing this bird is a mess. We talk about how the bird is found across 11 different states. So think about, you have to deal with the state agencies, and then the federal agencies, and then the private landowners. So all these different folks that you have to engage in these conversations for this bird's future. Not only that, but the threats vary. So when you look at this map, not only can you say, oh my gosh, what a poop show, but what you can see is on the left-hand side, more in the western portion of the bird's range, there's a lot of red. In the eastern portion of the bird's range, there's a lot of blue. Red signifies a lot of fires. And we're going to talk about that. So that's a big threat in the western portion of the bird's range. In the eastern portion, again, from science, we know that birds do not do well with oil and gas development, that sage-grouse do not respond well. And we see population declines when oil and gas comes in. So that is what we're looking at for the bird's range, and where do we have threats. But what's really cool, and isn't this photo is from Lewis and Clark's journal of a sage-grouse. So again, we've known about this bird for a long time. This bird has fascinated us as part of our culture, but it's been also known as a conservation concern for over half a century. Back in 1953, the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and so who WAFWA, Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies is, they are all the state game and fish agencies working together. Just like you have the Western Governors Association, you have your Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. That includes Colorado Parks and Wildlife, that includes Wyoming Game and Fish Department, etc. They all work together. And they together identified back in 1953 that sage-grouse are not doing well. So go forward a little bit, 1999 all through 2003, Fish and Wildlife Service received 8 petitions to list the greater sage-grouse under the Endangered Species Act. And then 2005, following that most recent one, U.S. Fish and Wildlife announced that sage-grouse did not warrant federal protection under the Endangered Species Act. And I'm gonna see, let's see if I can turn my camera back on. Let's see if this works. Okay, so 2005, Fish and Wildlife Service said, we looked at the latest science. Here's our review. We don't think the bird warrants federal protection. And then it gets really interesting, because in 2009, the court actually overturned that decision because of misconduct. There was Julie McDonald, who was a high up leader in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, was actually found to have changed field documents and pressured agency staff to change their findings. And so it was this huge blow up. And it wasn't just greater sage-grouse. This resulted in them having to review a bunch of other not warranted listing decisions under her leadership timeframe. So because of this, like the drama goes on, 2010, Fish and Wildlife has, because the court said, you know what, Fish and Wildlife Service, you need to review it. 2010, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service came back, and lo and behold, Fish and Wildlife Service said, yes, sage-grouse do warrant federal protection under the Endangered Species Act. Take a moment to think about where sage-grouse are. They're across the West, across 11 states. It was a huge deal when this came out. And the reason Fish and Wildlife said that is they look at a bunch of different criteria. And the reason they gave for their listing decision was twofold, those two bolded pieces. Because of loss or fragmentation of their habitat. Remember how we talked about how tied they are to it? And secondly, because of inadequacy of regulatory mechanisms or protections, basically. There were lack of protections in these federal plans. Both of these we're gonna see come up throughout the rest of our talk. So even though they said in 2010, yep, warrants federal protection, they didn't do anything. The bird and other species actually sat in this weird gray area, and it was precluded due to higher priority species. Well, by them sitting on it and not doing anything, no one knew how to manage about this bird. They were brought to court, and the court said, okay, in 2011, they said, okay, Fish and Wildlife Service, you have got to make a decision on how you're going to manage this bird or how you're going to handle this bird. You have to make that decision by September of 2015. So 2011, this bombshell drops. And between 2011 and 2015, oh, and again, just to remind you, most of their habitat is federal lands, BLM lands. So this, at this point, gets everyone really jazzed up and motivated, and people are realizing, oh my gosh. In fact, I remember sitting in central Wyoming at Casper College, and the governor of Wyoming it was a public meeting, and pulled in some folks from DC. And I remember him saying on a stage, if you think the spotted owl issue is bad, if you thought the wolf issue was contentious, you haven't seen anything until you've seen the greater sage-grouse issue. So we all knew, holy smokes, this is going to be big. And we talked about how problems with the habitat and problems with lack of protections. Well, where are we seeing their protections? Most of their protections are on Bureau of Land Management. And we see Bureau of Land Management has an enormous amount of influence. 1 out of every 10 surface acres is actually managed by the BLM. On this map, it's all that yellow area. But what does that look like for Colorado? Again, on this map here, the yellow are BLM managed surface acres. So they manage surface acres. They also manage about 8 million of that, about 27 million subsurface acres. The state is broken up into the 10 different field offices. For sage-grouse, again, we're talking about the northwestern part of the state. But again, just kind of wanted to orient you as to where BLM is, et cetera. So remember 2011 Fish and Wildlife, or the courts say, Fish and Wildlife Service, you have until 2015 to figure out if this bird really warrants federal protection, if it needs to go on the list or not be on the list. So there was this mad rush, and the federal agencies in that 4-year time frame for 10 states updated their management plans, the Federal Bureau of Land Management plans. That is a huge undertaking. Usually just one of these plans takes several years, and these federal management plans, and we'll go into it in a little bit detail at the end, dictate what can be done on a landscape. Tells you protections for cultural resources, historical trails, wildlife, grazing, mining, oil and gas development, everything. It is the law of the land for that particular geography that applies to that resource management plan. Takes several years to do it. They did 98 of them and grouped them together in that 4-year time frame. It was amazing. And what came from that is they brought together the latest scientists. It was an amazingly collaborative time in conservation. And they brought experts, whether you're researchers from universities, whether you're consultants who are doing research on the side in oil and gas development, or you're a county commissioner, or you're a rancher. They brought all these private landowners together, and from it developed these federal management plans that were passed in 2015. And a couple of things about these management plans: that they didn't treat all habitat as equal. On this map, the darker purple reflects the most important habitat for greater sage-grouse. The lighter purple is still general habitat, but less important, and therefore, because it supports fewer birds and therefore fewer protections. On that really important habitat, these plans did two incredibly important things. They improved habitat conditions, and they strove to minimize surface disturbance, both of those based on science. So as a science person myself, it was amazing to see science really influence management decisions and seeing people come together and work on plans across such an incredibly complex, large geography. And when I say that, there were meetings, pulling information together, sitting outside, talking outside. I will show you the image in the middle is the gentleman with the yellow tie was my coworker at the time, Brian Rutledge at Audubon. And he went to go see the head of Department of Interior at that time, Sally Jewell, wearing the red shirt. And he brought with him, Brian brought with him an oil and gas, a miner, a county commissioner, to all say, we need plans to understand how to manage properly in this landscape. It was, again, a time of people making concessions. Was it perfect? No, but it got a heck of a lot of attention. I like to joke around that my boyfriend at the time also did some social media around protections of greater sage-grouse. There's this landscape in the middle of the US, in the Intermountain West, that most people have no idea about. Most people will go through it and say it's a wasteland, there's nothing there, and that it has been treated as such for a really, really long time. And all of a sudden, you have reporters in Maine doing stories about this bird. You have movie stars putting out social media posts about this bird. It was really an amazing time for conservation. All said and done, lots of effort between 2011 and 2015. All these big federal plans come out with these science-based protections. And right here in Colorado at Rocky Mountain Arsenal is where Sally Jewell, second from the left, makes the announcement that yes, all these efforts by the states and the federal agencies have been considered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the bird does not warrant federal protections. It was a moment of celebration. You will note on this stage right now that you're looking at, you have 4 Western governors and a slew of federal agency leadership. That is not the situation we're in right now. But at this moment in time, people had a similar vision. Then we had a new presidency, and there's always upheaval. Whenever there's a new president, it seems like policies can change. And as with this new presidency in 2017, President Trump passes what is often known and referred to as their energy dominance agenda. This is the first real marker in the sand that the Trump administration is going to push energy development as a priority use of the public lands. So during this time frame, lots is happening. During his administration, lots is happening. And we, working alongside Rocky Mountain Wild and other organizations, are trying to keep up with all these policy changes. And what we're seeing happening is during that time frame, a real disregard for science, and protections end up being weakened. Those 2015 plans end up being reviewed, and the protections weaken further. There ends up being an increase in oil and gas development in sage-grouse habitat. And I'll show you some of the numbers of that here. So this, just to look at that map, in the dark purple, again, was that priority grouse habitat. I guess the most important grouse habitat. That is where they should have the strongest protections for survival of this bird. The lighter brown, lower protections. What you're seeing here is that that was an analysis of the Bureau of Land Management's own lease sale data. And between 2017 and 2019, that circular graph there shows that only 7% of the leases were sold in priority habitat, that dark purple, only 7%. You switch presidential administrations, going from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, and all of a sudden there's this concerted effort to develop in priority, or that most important sage-grouse habitat, goes from 7% to 27%. And shown in red there are the lease sales. All of a sudden you see them at that real overlap with what's going on, where the bird is found. So this, again, I feel like I was joking around with a former colleague of mine that if there was to be a an opera that involved wildlife, you would have sage-grouse be the star of it. Because again, you have all this drama around this bird. Well, so now you have a new presidency. Again, just like the previous presidency, you have some new policies. And it appears as this new, our current administration is looking to work more towards conservation. When you have a new agency or new federal administration, you also have new agency leadership. We have Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland, who replaced Sally Jewell, if you remember that photo from before, under the Obama administration. The new is Secretary Deb Haaland. We actually also have some folks in leadership of the Bureau of Land Management. We have Tracy Stone Manning, who's now the director of the BLM, who has a very deep knowledge of sagebrush country and the sage-grouse issue, which is great. We have some really informed leadership. She used to work for National Wildlife Federation, used to also work for the Montana governor, so really has strong roots in the West. We have Nada Culver, who is Deputy Director of Policy and Programs. Also, she is a lawyer by training and is incredibly familiar with a lot of the main players, has very good relationships with a broad range of stakeholders. And I think when we talk about success in conservation, you really need to have good relationships. And she brings that to the table. She used to work for a National Audubon Society and the Wilderness Society. So some strong presence there. So we've talked about the biology. We've talked about who manages the bird. We talked about what were some of the threats to the bird. Now it's so where are we now? And we're looking at some major administrative actions in regards to oil and gas development. Because remember when we talked about where the bird is on the eastern portion of the range, including oil and gas development, we know that one of the big threats is oil and gas development. The birds do not like disturbances, and they will ultimately leave a lek. It takes a little while, but they'll leave the lek and the numbers will start to plummet. So as soon as basically the presidency begins January 2021, April, that energy dominance agenda gets reversed. And we start to see a little bit of a pause in oil and gas development. But then that starts up again in August of last year. And that's when we start to see the first lease sale announced. And Rocky Mountain Wild, I cannot give enough shout out to Allison and team. They do a phenomenal job on looking at where those parcels are and helping us all collectively understand what might be the environmental impacts. So when we look at that oil and gas, that very first lease sale under this new presidency, we see 733,000 acres being proposed for lease, and that's across 8 states. That takes into account parcels that were nominated by oil and gas industry from previous lease sales that had been deferred. So basically everything is being put on the table. When you take a look at that, what are we talking about with those 733,000 acres? 80% of them are in grouse habitat, 45% of which are in priority grouse habitat. So there was a lot of concern when we saw that lease sale come up. So what are we talking about in Colorado? In Colorado, they were proposing to have 119 parcels be put up for auction. And if a company will propose nominate an area for development, if it goes through the process and they end up bidding on it and winning that bid, they then have rights to develop on it for 10 years. They become the primary purpose of that landscape, public lands. So 119 parcels were nominated originally, encompassing 142,000 acres. If you'll see, most of them are up in like the little northwest part of Colorado, and then you have, but then even more down on eastern portion of Colorado. So 27 parcels out of that 119 are in grouse habitat, only 22,000 acres in priority habitat. But nonetheless, we were very concerned about this. So what does Wyoming look like now? Wyoming looks a little different than Colorado. Again, that's like the stronghold for the species. 37 to 38% of the birds are found in Wyoming. Wyoming does not have an income tax because of the revenue from oil and gas development. So there is a strong connection to the state's economy with oil and gas development. And again, we know oil and gas development does not go well with sage-grouse. when for, again, 8 of the states had oil and gas lease sales, 77% of those parcels were in Wyoming. It was a ton. The map that you're looking at overlays in red those oil and gas parcels with grouse habitat. Darker orange is priority habitat. So we see a lot of it happening there. Okay, so after that, that's when we first heard, August of last year, we first heard that they were going to be doing a lease sale. We got a sense of what parcels they're considering. A bunch of organizations, a bunch of individuals, Audubon worked with Rocky Mountain Wild. We submitted comments and we argued that this lease sale should not be happening now, and it should definitely not be leasing in grouse habitat at this point in time. And we'll go into why shortly. But what else happened last year that was interesting is that there was a big report that was looking at the federal oil and gas leasing program. And this report was finally released, which was a report done by the federal government to review their own program. And they came back and said, basically, the federal oil and gas leasing program is in dire state for the following reasons. These royalty rates are really cutting the American public short on what they ought to get for these parcels. There needs to be more financial assurances, and we need to avoid conflict more than we are with other uses. Okay, lots of text here, and I apologize, but you've seen some of this before. We talked about how in August, we saw our first lease sale. And now we have just recently heard the outcome of those comments that Audubon, Rocky Mountain Wild, and others submitted. And as a result of that, we had actually a reduction of lease sale parcels by 80%, which is great. And what happened is they deferred, the BLM took everyone's comments and they took a look at their own policies. They did additional review, and they also worked with state BLM directors, and they pulled a bunch of those parcels, 80% of them, from the auction block, which is great. So that they're not supposed to go forward with those parcels now. In Colorado, they started off thinking that there's going to be 142,000 acres. Now it's down to 5,000 acres. So down by 96%. In Wyoming, it went down by 77%. What did Audubon, Rocky Mountain Wild, and others argue in those comments? Well, we used some really amazing and alarming new science that had just come out. Last year, the U.S. Geological Survey, which is the research arm of the federal government, put together a report. And that report looked at all the data, the lek counts, because I remember that's the best time you can see the birds. And that's how we determine how sage-grouse populations are doing, is counting them at their leks year after year after year in the spring. Well, the U.S. Geological Survey, USGS, reached out to all these state agencies and got all their lek data and all their numbers since 1965. And we saw this decline. So we have a peer-reviewed work that shows across the range a decline of 3% per year. And at first, that may not sound a lot, but what that actually means is we have an 80% decline in greater sage-grouse. What's also interesting in their work is that we found that not all leks face the same risks. If you look at the graphic, and it is a little blurry, but what it shows you are these different leks. Those little circles are those leks, they're mating grounds. That's where we're counting the birds. And that gives us a lot of their life history is actually close to those leks. So it kind of gives you a really good sense of how the bird is doing. And if you look at this, you see the darker purple, sort of a brownish color leks are the most likely to be extirpated in the next 19 years. Even more startling is that 78% of the leks have a high chance of blinking out in the next 50 years. So what we're hearing from these trends, and based on these trends and analyses by scientists, the sage-grouse, which we've known for a while, again, going back to 1953, are not doing well. In fact, they're really doing very poorly. And what does that mean for the sagebrush ecosystem? And why does this seem to vary? The West, remember the West were the fires, and the East was the oil and gas development. So why did these researchers find that actually the birds were doing worse in the Western portion? Well, let's talk about that. Another massive report came out last year. The second report is expected to come out later this year. And this report was pulled together by the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, USGS, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Land Management. It included 94 different experts and scientists to pull together this report. And it's basically like a Bible. It's like 400 pages long. And it really talks about the health of the sagebrush ecosystem. Not surprisingly, it's not doing well. And one of the major reasons it's not doing well is because of cheatgrass. I'm kind of curious, let me know, have you heard of cheatgrass before? And awesome. And cheatgrass is, okay, so in this, a neighbor across the street is starting to have cheatgrass come up, and I'm kind of hyperventilating. So you see it in town as well, on the outside of town. You also see it if you're riding down the interstate. You'll see it along the roadways. And the cheatgrass is very appropriately named. It is an invasive annual grass that actually came over from Asia. It's been here for decades. And cheatgrass is incredibly aggressive because it is the first, if the surface soil is disturbed, it'll come in, and it is the first to green up. It outcompetes your natives, and it is the first to then dry up and release its seed. And so it also outcompetes the native because it's just the first. It's kind of a cheater. And when it does dry up, when you're driving on the highway, you'll see the rest of the area might be green. Those yellow, that bright yellow straw color, that's cheatgrass because it has dried up early and has gone to seed fast. Once they dry up, it becomes basically a match waiting to be lit. It is incredibly, it spreads fire like nobody's business. And once fire comes in there, it kills your dominant plants, your sagebrush plants, your anchors, and then it kills a bunch of the other plants in the ecosystem. It completely changes the landscape. And cheatgrass, you used to have fires in sagebrush country. It's a natural part of the ecosystem. However, fires used to happen every 50 to 100 years. You're now having fires every 5 to 10 years. They're hotter, larger, and more intense. And cheatgrass, once your landscape converts to cheatgrass, it's not even palatable to cattle. Wildlife don't like it. It becomes a monoculture and just becomes just one big fire pit. Now, what does that mean for sage-grouse? Again, this talk is about sage-grouse. Well, just to give you a sense, a table here. On the left-hand side are all your landowners. It could be private land, it could be Bureau of Land Management, it could be state lands. And then your columns show the amount of greater sage-grouse habitat that was burned in a given year. The first circle on your far right shows you had about 600,000 acres burned in 2016. Because of cheatgrass and other invasive annual grasses, that number quadrupled in just a couple of years. So it is incredibly aggressive. Here's a graphic that just shows you briefly the fires in the landscape there, and the dark red are fires in sagebrush country. So you see it happens a lot in the West, right? And again, to that description of when you have a healthy sagebrush ecosystem, it's that photo on your far right. When it gets taken over by cheatgrass, you have a monoculture. But it's not just cheatgrass. Across the West, we have ventonata, we have medusa head, we have all these other species that we're really trying hard to figure out how to handle. But I've laid the groundwork, hopefully, about how cool this bird is, about the drama related to its management, about what's happened to date thus far with the bird. And I wanted to kind of end on letting you know what's happening right now. And what's happening right now is remember those resource management plans that were updated in 2015, and they encompassed a huge swath of the West. These resource management plans determine when things can be done. They were passed in 2015. They were the foundation for why the bird was not listed under the Endangered Species Act. They were weakened in 2019. Well, now they're being reviewed again by the Bureau of Land Management. And that's because if you look at that little circle chart there, BLM manages 45% of the sagebrush habitat, and the bird is tied to the habitat. So that quote there, that BLM is committed to reversing long-term downward trends in sage-grouse populations and habitats, is actually on the BLM's website. So we're starting that whole review process. What does that look like? Those blue stars are the public comment opportunity. And in the process, you see a scoping period. There's some planning is done. They release a scoping report and you can comment. And Audubon, Rocky Mountain Wild, others submitted comments. And then BLM reviews these, and then they release a draft resource management plan. And then the BLM responds to those and they pick a preferred alternative. And then they release a proposed resource management plan. And then there's another comment period. And finally, there's a decision. And the reason that the BLM said we need to revise, review, amend these resource management plans is because there's been new scientific information. Since 2015, there have been more than 300 publications. That's insane. So they wanted to take into account all this new information. Again, that landscape is changing so fast due to, they specifically call out climate change and drought. And we know that in the West, we know drought is bad. And we've had those days where the smoke has just come in from hundreds of miles away from fires. We know it's bad. So that's what we're in the middle of right now. The scoping ended in February of this year. There were 260 unique comments. There were 1,900 substantive comments and 24,000 forms. And I'll tell you, we'll visit about the forms in a second. And then what's next? Well, the draft resource management plan is supposed to come out later this year. So I am sure that you will be hearing from organizations like Rocky Mountain Wild about opportunities to engage. Ultimately, what we're hearing is this whole decision is supposed to be finalized and made by mid-2024. So it's a very ambitious timeline considering the large geography they're talking about, when usually just doing one small area can take years. But people will say, you know, I get an action alert. And an action alert is when an email comes to your email that tells you what the situation is, and you can comment from the convenience of your own home, from your office or whatever, and take part in it. Those automatic forms. You can strengthen those by adding your own personal, like I recently filled out an action alert and I changed the text, and that makes it more powerful. Change the text to why it matters to me. And I'd like to share, people say, does that make a difference? It makes a difference because those action alerts show a lot of influence, and we can get a lot more people taking part in those action alerts. I'll explain why those action alerts matter. But first, your influence. There were studies done in 2009 and 2020 that found that each of you on this call has a huge amount of influence with your friends, family, and others that you know. People are twice more likely to learn something. Like, for example, I think we have 5 million birds flying over Colorado tonight as part of the migration, spring migration. Wow, that's amazing. People are more likely to learn when they hear from people that they know. And they're 10 times more likely to act on an issue when they hear it from people that know. So should you happen to get an action alert on sage-grouse in later this year, we hope you'll take action. We hope you'll take 5 minutes to read it, to get informed, to fill it out and hit send, and then to also share it with somebody else. Let them know they can take part in this as well. Why does this matter? Those 24,000 action alerts matter because we can, depending on who the organization, I can speak only for Audubon, we can track that information and say, oh my gosh, we had 15,000 of those comments came from Colorado. And then we can reach out to the Colorado congressional leaders and say, this really matters to your constituents. We can also go to our funders and say, look, our members are really active. Can you help provide us funding so that we can keep working on this issue? We can go to the Bureau of Land Management and say, these are some major concerns. So yes, those action alerts matter a lot. On that note, Chris, I believe that we had chatted about kind of what you wanted me to go over today. I hope I have done an okay job of kind of hitting the high points, but I also realize there are likely some questions still out there. And so I just wanted to see if you want to be the in-between or how we want to handle that.
Yeah, we had some come through the chat. So Matt, I don't know if you want to come off mic or come on mic and ask your questions.
Yeah, I just had a couple questions. One was in your map on the I guess it was the 2015 post like RMP sort of decisions on habitat. There wasn't any designated habitat for greater sage-grouse in eastern Washington. I was curious if you know why that is. And then the other question was I thought on your slide for deep-rooted sagebrush plants, cheatgrass was listed, but I may have misread that. I thought it was at the far right end of that like slide, but I may have misread that. But I was, because that is a non-native species, right?
Right. Yes. Yes. So I'm gonna, as you were talking, so for Eastern Washington, the reason that you didn't see any priority habitat, that was through the federal process, because a lot of the land in Washington is privately owned where sage-grouse are found. So that's why you don't have any federally designated habitats in Washington. What's interesting is actually they had a massive burning last year. They had some big burns and it wiped out almost all the sage-grouse habitat in Washington, and the bird is now listed at the state level in Washington as endangered. It was heartbreaking. Maybe you've heard of pygmy rabbits too. So pygmy rabbits, the world's cutest little tiny rabbit. I mean, they're ridiculous. They're also in the sagebrush ecosystem, the sagebrush obligate. And they are not doing well either. And so a lot of the idea is if you help sage grouse, you're helping the habitat that helps a lot of other critters that are not doing well, like pygmy rabbits. Well, the reason I'm sharing about pygmy rabbits is they actually had a bunch of pygmy rabbits introduced into some of the same areas where the fires were. And so it was a huge blow, not only to sage grouse, but to pygmy rabbits in Washington. So it was devastating. And if you're interested, I can pass along to Chris and Alice and stuff about Washington. It's really interesting. There was a great podcast that was done about it because it was kind of the example of when things get bad, this can happen. And then cheatgrass, let me find that slide. Oh. Okay, so I'm gonna see if I can't share my screen. And it's always good when I get questions, then I realize, oh, this obviously I did not a very good job of explaining this piece. Okay, so let's see if I can't make that, see if I can make it bigger. And I'm working on one screen, so let's see. Well, we're gonna try and see if this, okay. So the invasive weed, and on this screen, it's probably really painful. It's on the second to the far right. It says invasive weed. And the take home, and this poster was actually created by NRCS. And the point of this is to show these others all these others are native plants, and see how deep their roots go and the different kinds of roots that they have. The invasive weeds are really shallow. So the invasive plants like cheatgrass, like ventonata, all have really shallow roots, but they do outcompete just because they get in there early and go to seed faster. But they truly destroy an ecosystem. Matt, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you so much. I missed that little red font of the invasive part, but and thanks for letting me know about Eastern Washington too. That's really interesting.
Yeah. Are there any other questions folks might have? Or clarifications? Allison, you have been immersed in this issue for so long. Is there anything else that that would be good to add to the conversation?
I'm also away from home, so hopefully you can hear me. You mentioned that we might have information about visiting sage-grouse flags, and unfortunately we don't. The reason is we were working with other nonprofits to try to run flag visits ourselves, and that's really complicated. And it was just too much for a nonprofit, for even a collaboration between nonprofits to take on. So to find them, you would need to look for commercial operations. And I definitely can reach out to us. I can do more research into finding what the reputable ones are if people are interested. But we're not doing that anymore.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Alice. That's a really good point. Yeah, the previous tours were great when they're happening, but that is a big lift. And I did see you put that podcast link in there, which is awesome. If you all have a chance to, she did a really, really great job on that. So I would encourage you to take a listen to that. I did add my email address. Matt, Chelsea, if you're interested in going to see a lek, if you remember, there's a whole bunch more grouse just north of us in Wyoming. And I know like our the Laramie Audubon chapter and the Cheyenne one both go and do lek tours as part of one of their field trips. So if you let me know you're interested in it, I can connect you with the Laramie chapter and the Cheyenne chapter, and you could get on their email distribution list if you're interested, and that way you can stay up on it. Again, they do happen around March through April, and so we're pretty much done with it now, but next year it is a really cool opportunity. And if not too, I could also send, I'm not sure what Chris will kind of follow up you do with folks, but there's some great fun videos online that show the birds on the lek and talk about the sagebrush ecosystem. I could share that with you if you're interested.
And the podcast also has some recordings from the lek. And given that you're there really early in the morning, the sounds are a real big part of the experience. And the person who did the podcast lives in Eastern Washington. So that is a big part of what you talked about.
Yeah, I would certainly appreciate that information. I would be happy to receive it. I'm down here in Parker, which is quite a bit out of the sage-grouse territory, it looks like. But as I am planning my garden for this year, I'm thinking a lot about native species and invasive plants. And is it reasonable to say that to help grouse, people all the way in Parker also need to be involved in how they're managing their own land so we don't get worse cheatgrass issues? Or is that kind of like a sailed ship?
Because of proximity, Parker's quite a ways away. I would say that cheatgrass is such a big issue out west that anything we can do to stop it and pull it early before it takes off is important for wildlife, period. And also, FYI, if you talk to vets, especially vets right up against sagebrush country, dogs get destroyed by cheatgrass. It gets all in their faces, in their paws. It is a problem. And so I would say it'd be harder to make that direct connection to sage-grouse because of proximity, but I think it's just good overall for wildlife, right? To the point of the avian flu that's going around, that's killing a lot of birds, and just like how we are with the pandemic, when it's at its highest level, we try not to concentrate each other around ourselves. We try to space ourselves out. With the flu, avian flu, same thing. We're recommending to take down feeders and to put away the bird baths, just so that we don't concentrate the birds, so that they are less likely to get infected. Having said that, when you plant native plants, it provides the food and the shelter for birds just naturally, and all kinds of other wildlife. So I think there's a lot of win-win to getting rid of those invasives and putting in some native plants.
Certainly, yeah. I'm trying to keep my eyes on ways that I can help communicate about the seriousness of invasive plants right now.
Yes. Yes. I put my email in the chat box. Feel free, Chelsea, to shoot me an email, and I can do some more noodling too to see if I can't think of anything to help you out. I will, on the previous slide, talked about the influence that you have in social media. Nextdoor, if you guys are at all involved in Nextdoor, it is a fabulous app to reach out to your neighbors on stuff, especially native plants and gardening. It's a great way to, people are always interested.
Nextdoor is exactly what I was thinking about. We do have like a few people though that like when you mention like, hey, this is a native plant, it's good for the environment, they'll become like belligerent at the mere mention of environment. And so that's like, it's tricky and obnoxious.
Low water, like who doesn't like low water? Like low water, they're beautiful perennials. It brings hummingbirds to my garden. Try and get angry at me for bringing hummingbirds to my garden.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad you're doing that, Chelsea. That's awesome.
Well, I don't know. We'll see if it bears fruit.
I have two more questions if there's still time.
Sure.
One is, and if it's easier to just answer in the chat, that's fine. But I was curious if there's any good podcasts or folks you'd recommend, maybe yourself, on learning more about the Gunnison sage-grouse. And then the second question was, do you know the status of the potential ESA listing for greater sage-grouse? And like, what would you say is the Audubon's perspective on, like, is it more strategic to work? I mean, maybe it's both. Like, it just seems like the RMPs in 2015, right, were an attempt to avoid a listing decision. And then obviously with the change of administration, like, environmentalists got the short end of the stick, it seems like, on that one. Like, it might have been better off to just list the species to like cement those protections rather than leaving them up to the, an interior administration under Trump. Right. So I wonder what the Audubon's position is on ultimately like listing them as endangered or threatened.
So I think a great answer to that, those excellent questions, Matt, is actually Gunnison sage-grouse. So again, do me a favor, shoot me an email if you're able to see. Can you see the chat box? And can you copy and paste stuff in the chat box? I wasn't sure if you're joining via phone or not.
Yep, I can see it.
Okay, shoot me an email and I can send you some stuff on Gunnison. And Rocky Mountain Wild has also done a ton of stuff on Gunnison sage-grouse, so they may be able to follow up with you as well. But Gunnison sage-grouse, in my opinion, and talking to scientists and researchers, is an example of what can go wrong. They're in 7 isolated populations. There's so few of them. There's concern about genetic health. That's what we don't want greater sage-grouse to get to. We're not there yet, but all science suggests that we're getting there if we don't take advantage of this opportunity to right the ship. And have some good protections that take into account the best priority, the highest value priority habitat. So I also think, talking to colleagues, that the Endangered Species Act is incredibly valuable. It's a very important law and tool, and it motivates people to get to the table and talk, right? It has Wyoming being a leader on sage-grouse for a long time because they saw the writing on the wall, because they were directly impacted if the bird was to be listed. Concern is ESA. Once you have the ESA, then you have, once a species is listed under the Endangered Species Act, you sometimes have people less likely wanting to talk to each other and make some compromises and find solutions together. I think we're still in that space. It's pretty darn scary space. We're in there's much more pressure to get it done now than we had in 2015, based on how the populations are doing, based on how the habitat is doing. Because look at Washington, for example, you had those big fires. We need to get it done right. And we need to come together. And the sad part is when that photo of being on the, when Brian Rutledge was speaking at the podium, you had those 4 Western governors. You couldn't get that today. There's so much more partisanship now. And so that's very concerning. But that, at the same time, I'm not giving up hope altogether. I feel like we will have collectively failed if that bird gets on the ESA list. we can still make a difference. We have really knowledgeable people in leadership positions at the BLM, and we have really good science out there that can help guide us. We just need the political will.
Thanks.
Okay, good. All right, well, I have my kiddos lacrosse game I'm digging into. So I'm gonna switch out of mom and professional gear and get into my my soccer or my lacrosse assistant coach gear. So it has been such a pleasure talking with everybody. Matt, Allison, good to see you again, Chelsea. So thanks for joining today. I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Dolly. This is amazing.
Yeah, thank you. This was fantastic. I really appreciate it.
Yay, stay in touch. Always happy to receive emails.